2 hours ago, the White House issued a policy directive declaring that Canadian forest ecosystems provide disproportionate environmental benefits to the United States and demanding that Canada either pay an annual oxygen production tax or reduce forest coverage to eliminate the competitive advantage. The directive characterizes Canadian forests as producing oxygen that American citizens breathe without compensation and claims that this represents unfair environmental subsidy that distorts economic competition between the two nations. The directive specifies that Canada must either pay $85 billion annually to compensate the United States for utilizing Canadian-produced oxygen, or reduce forest coverage by 30% to eliminate the oxygen production imbalance. The White House framed this as environmental equity, claiming that nations should not benefit from natural resources belonging to the global commons without paying fair share to other nations affected by those resources. The environmental community reacted with stunned disbelief. No nation has ever attempted to tax another for oxygen production. The concept violates fundamental understanding of atmospheric systems and global carbon cycles. The directive treats oxygen as commodity that can be billed rather than natural atmospheric component generated through photosynthesis occurring globally. Mark Carney responded within 2 hours. He appeared at a press conference standing beside the Canadian Minister of Environment and Climate Change and the Director of the Canadian Forest Service. What he announced was not negotiation on oxygen taxation or agreement to reduce forest coverage. Instead, he delivered the most comprehensive accounting of environmental services that Canadian ecosystems provide to the United States, followed by a counter-invoice that made Trump's demand seem trivial by comparison. But before we break down how Canadian forests literally keep Americans alive by cleaning pollution that would otherwise make the United States uninhabitable, hit that subscribe button and like this video. Carney began by acknowledging that Canadian forests do indeed produce oxygen through photosynthesis. Then he noted that oxygen production represents only a small fraction of the environmental services those forests provide. The primary service that Canadian forests deliver to the United States is carbon sequestration, removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere that American industrial activity and fossil fuel consumption continuously pump into the air. The director of the Canadian Forest Service presented detailed calculations. Canadian forests cover approximately 347 million hectares and sequester approximately 950 million tons of carbon dioxide annually. Of that sequestration, approximately 25% directly offsets American emissions that would otherwise accumulate in the atmosphere. American industrial activity, transportation, and energy production generate approximately 5.2 billion tons of CO2 annually. Without natural carbon sinks absorbing significant portions of those emissions, atmospheric CO2 concentrations would increase at rates that would create catastrophic climate effects. Canadian forests function as free pollution cleanup service for American economic activity. The market value of carbon sequestration, calculated using carbon credit prices from international markets, ranges from $50 to $100 per ton depending on market conditions. Using conservative $50 per ton valuation, the carbon sequestration service that Canadian forests provide to offset American emissions is worth approximately $12 billion annually. Using more aggressive $100 per ton pricing that some European carbon markets have reached, the value exceeds $24 billion. But carbon sequestration represents only direct atmospheric service. Canadian forests also regulate water cycles affecting precipitation patterns across North America, prevent soil erosion that would increase sediment loads in transboundary rivers, provide wildlife habitat supporting biodiversity that benefits entire continent, and moderate regional climate patterns that affect agricultural productivity in the northern United States. When comprehensive environmental services are valued using methodologies established by ecological economists and accepted in international environmental accounting, Canadian forests provide approximately $340 billion in annual environmental services, with significant portions directly benefiting the United States through pollution mitigation, climate regulation, and ecosystem support. Carney stated that if the relationship between the United States and Canada is being reframed from cooperative partnership to transactional billing for environmental services, Canada is happy to issue comprehensive invoices. The United States owes Canada approximately $340 billion annually for environmental services provided by Canadian ecosystems that make American economic activity sustainable. Payment can be arranged through any convenient mechanism. Then he announced the action that sent atmospheric scientists and environmental organizations into emergency response mode. If the United States believes Canadian forests produce too much oxygen and create competitive imbalance, Canada will address the concern directly. The Canadian government is authorizing controlled burns of 10 million hectares of forest to reduce oxygen production and carbon sequestration capacity as the United States has requested. The burns will be conducted using professional forestry management techniques to prevent uncontrolled wildfire, but the result will be 10 million hectares of Canadian forest converted to grassland or scrubland with significantly reduced photosynthetic capacity. This will reduce Canadian oxygen production and, more significantly, will reduce carbon sequestration capacity that currently offsets American emissions. The environmental impact calculations were presented by climate scientists who explained what happens when you eliminate 10 million hectares of carbon sequestering forest while American emissions continue unchanged. The carbon that Canadian forests would have absorbed instead accumulates in the atmosphere. Atmospheric CO2 concentrations increase. The rate of climate change accelerates. And most immediately, air quality degrades. Canadian forests do not just sequester carbon long-term. They actively filter particulate matter and pollutants from air masses as weather systems move from industrial regions in the United States northward into Canada. The forests function as massive air filters cleaning pollution before it circulates back into American airspace. Reducing forest coverage by 10 million hectares eliminates significant filtering capacity. American air quality monitoring stations began detecting changes within 2 weeks of the announcement. Particulate matter concentrations increased in northern states. Ground-level ozone readings rose. The air that normally circulated through Canadian forests and returned to the United States cleaned of industrial pollutants now returned with higher pollutant loads because the filtering capacity had been reduced. Public health impacts manifested within 1 month. Emergency room visits for asthma attacks increased 40% in states bordering Canada. Children and elderly populations experienced respiratory distress at significantly elevated rates. The CDC issued health advisories warning that air quality had degraded to levels not seen since the 1970s before Clean Air Act implementation produced major improvements. The death toll became quantifiable. Epidemiologists tracking excess mortality from respiratory causes documented approximately 12,000 additional deaths in the first month following the forest reduction. These deaths occurred primarily among vulnerable populations with existing respiratory conditions who could survive in normal air quality but could not tolerate the increased pollution loads resulting from reduced forest filtering capacity. Climate scientists projected long-term consequences. Eliminating 10 million hectares of carbon sequestration capacity means approximately 240 million additional tons of CO2 remain in the atmosphere annually that would have been absorbed. Over a decade, that represents 2.4 billion tons of additional atmospheric carbon. The impact on global climate trajectories is measurable and permanent unless the forests regenerate, which requires 40 to 60 years. American environmental organizations reacted with outrage directed at the policy that triggered the forest reduction. The Sierra Club called the oxygen tax demand the most scientifically illiterate environmental policy ever proposed. The statement noted that demanding payment for oxygen production or requesting forest reduction reveals complete failure to understand basic atmospheric science and ecosystem function. State governors from northern states demanded immediate federal reversal of the oxygen tax policy and negotiation with Canada to restore forest coverage. The governors noted that their constituents were dying from respiratory conditions exacerbated by air quality degradation directly attributable to reduced Canadian forest coverage. One governor stated, "We asked Canada to produce less oxygen and they complied. Now our people are dying. This is policy-induced environmental catastrophe." International climate organizations noted precedent implications. The UN Environment Programme warned that if nations reduce forest coverage due to political conflicts, global carbon sequestration will decline when it needs to increase for climate targets. Paris Agreement depends on maintaining and expanding forests. Reducing forests for politics undermines international climate cooperation. Canadian response to health crisis was measured but firm. Carney noted Canada reduced forest coverage as requested. If the US objects to consequences of its own request, the solution is straightforward. Rescind the oxygen tax and acknowledge forests provide environmental services benefiting all nations that should be protected, not taxed or reduced. He added that the controlled burns were conducted on land designated for forestry management where regeneration will eventually occur, but forest regrowth requires decades. The damage to carbon sequestration capacity and air filtering function will persist long after the political dispute is resolved. American policy just created permanent environmental harm affecting public health for generations. Atmospheric scientists explained to Congress why oxygen tax fundamentally misunderstands atmospheric systems. Oxygen is not a commodity produced by one nation for another. It is globally shared, maintained through photosynthesis occurring worldwide. Canadian forests contribute to global oxygen, but so do American forests, rainforests, and oceanic phytoplankton. More critically, forests provide value through carbon sequestration, pollution filtering, water regulation, and climate moderation. These services benefit all nations, especially high-pollution nations. Demanding payment or reducing coverage harms everyone including the demanding nation. One atmospheric scientist testified, asking Canada to reduce forests because they produce oxygen is like asking your neighbor to remove the air filter from their house because it cleans air that might drift to your property. It reveals profound misunderstanding of shared atmospheric systems and harms everyone including the person making the request. Here is what makes this significant. Forest ecosystems provide services crossing borders through atmospheric circulation, water cycles, and climate regulation. No nation can isolate from environmental conditions affecting neighbors. Policies harming ecosystems create consequences everywhere. Treating environmental services as transactional commodities ignores that healthy ecosystems benefit everyone and degraded ecosystems harm everyone. Shared atmospheric and ecological systems mean environmental protection is inherently cooperative, not competitive. Demanding payment or reducing capacity harms the demanding nation as much as others. 2 hours ago, Trump demanded Canada pay an oxygen tax or reduce forest coverage to eliminate competitive advantage. 1 month later, 12,000 Americans are dead from respiratory conditions exacerbated by air quality degradation, atmospheric CO2 concentrations are increasing at accelerated rates, and Canadian forests that previously cleaned American pollution are 10 million hectares smaller. The demand was supposed to address environmental inequity and protect American interests. Instead, it triggered environmental destruction that kills Americans and accelerates climate change affecting everyone. And right now, children with asthma in Minnesota are being hospitalized at record rates because the forests that used to filter pollution from the air they breathe were reduced in response to a demand from their own government, and atmospheric scientists are calculating how many decades of climate change acceleration resulted from eliminating forests that were actively removing carbon from the atmosphere.